Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Low Production Value Sphere podcast, which is shot from my terrace hideout near Kadal in northern Mali. I have with me the first returning guest in the history of the show, Ross Douthat, best columnist in the English language, currently practicing the craft. And it's not like there are very good French language columnists, to be honest. And no other languages matter. So let's just say best columnist in the world in any language. And you're here. So last time we talked mostly about populism and the Trump administration and so on, but you have a new book out.
That's right.
And I was just telling you before, and I will tell the audience now, I finished reading the book, and it's a very good book. I enjoyed it very much. To be completely honest, I was somewhat skeptical of both the concept of the book itself and whether there was a need for such a book. But reading the book changed my mind. I think it's a good book, and I think it's a needed book. Why don't you explain what it is in a couple minutes, and then I have a bunch of things to talk about.
That's good. Thank you so much for having me back. I'm really grateful that you would permit a rare double dipping for those of us on the podcast circuit. And when it's translated into French, obviously I can come back and we can try and do it all en français.
Yeah, it's good. Croire.
Croire. I'm sorry. Croire. So yeah, the book is called Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. The subtitle sort of summarizes it, I think, fairly adequately. And it is, I think you were right to be skeptical. It is a somewhat curious sort of book in that most books that are about religion as a broad category and that are favorable to religion as a broad category are doing some sort of, utilitarian sociological case for religion, right? There's a lot of books about why religion is good because it's good for you. And then there's a lot of books about why specific religions are true. Jesus really did rise from the dead and so on. And this book sort of falls somewhere in between in that I'm not making a utilitarian case for religion. I'm very intent on not doing that from the start. And
yes,
not that I don't think that a utilitarian case for religion can work. It can work but it works because religion gets at profound truths about the world, and you would expect, if you get at profound truths about the world, it might also help your marriage or your community or help you, build beautiful Gothic cathedrals and so on. But the argument in the book is that there is a kind of sort of general religious perspective on the world that you can reason your way to and accept without having some kind of revelation from on high. You can accept basically that you should be religious, that you should be oriented towards the source of ultimate meaning in the universe. You should assume that source of ultimate meaning, we'll call it God, right? Probably cares in some way about the human race, probably cares about you, had human beings in mind when the whole thing was set up to begin with, and that there are various ways, is natural and supernatural, through which you can align yourself with and sort of interact with higher forms of reality, and that this is worth doing because guess what? We're all going to die. Our life is time-bound and finite, and whatever we're here to do probably has to make sense in terms of some larger whole that we shouldn't ignore. So that's essentially the argument of the first half of the book, right? Is trying to make a kind of basic case for thinking that the world is designed, consciousness is supernatural, other supernatural happenings, mystical, miraculous, and so on are real, and that's enough to get you to the point of deciding you should be religious. And then the next part of the book is kind of a self-help book, in sort of an odd way, but saying, okay, so you think you should be religious. There are a lot of religions in the world. If you don't have sort of a special sense that one of them is true, how could you reasonably approach the task of exploring religion? So that goes on for a few chapters talking about stumbling blocks that people have, why it's better to join a organized religion rather than just opening yourself to the mystery of the universe. And the answer is because of demons. There are some other answers too, but that's one of the answers. And then the book ends because it is, in the end, it is sort of a case for Christianity in disguise. I'm sort of, trying to walk the reader through arguments that you don't have to be a Christian to accept. But then the last
Yes, and
chapter is
it's very
explaining
well made. I was
very well. I don't, I mean, it's a little obvious, right? Like I say it at the outset. I tell people they could stop reading before the last chapter, but I don't think very many people
I
would do that.
deleted my the draft of my letter to the Inquisition denouncing you for indifferentism.
I appreciate it. The Inquisition these days is, they're hard up, so they're after me for other reasons. But yeah, so it ends by talking about why I think being Christian, from my own perspective, but a broader perspective, makes sense in the light of the kind of analysis of religion and religious phenomena that I've described. So it's sort of like if you started with a kind of, William James varieties of religious experience meets, one of these books about intelligent design, or meets David Bentley Hart, right? And then tries to get at the end to why the figure of Jesus and the resurrection sort of stands out and offers a controlling revelation, is the phrase that I use, but you could use a different phrase. So that's the idea. And I think I'll just say, I think, the usefulness. I mean, everyone has a different set of encounters, right, with people who aren't
Yes.
religious. My set of encounters comes through writing for the New York Times, which obviously has a fairly secular, not exclusively so, but fairly secular readership, and being around a lot of people who are either secular or have a kind of, belief in belief, a sort of friendliness to religion. I think you and I both probably have a certain number of right of center friends who fall into this category. And some of those people would like to be maybe genuinely religious, but think that you just can't be and still be a reasonable, sensible, rational person.
Right.
And so I think there's some use in, before you get around to the resurrection of Jesus, saying that, actually, no, you can. And in fact, the religious person is a bit more reasonable and rational than at least certain kinds of aggressive atheists.
Yeah. So that's a very good summary, and it sort of segues into, I hate that word, but it links to my next topic and why I thought the book was interesting and needed, which is, there's tons of books about religion, and you sort of open by talking about the new atheist era, which was sort of both for me and you are sort of awakening to like internet punditry and like being in the world of, fighting with other people who write for a living. Um, and I was sort of tired of this, but you make a very interesting sociological observation, and one which I hadn't made, and which, I believe you when you say it is, but I haven't seen it, which is this sense that, you know, 15, 20 years ago when this began, my God, um, people still had a sort of background knowledge, awareness about Christianity, and therefore they were actively rejecting something that they thought they knew, or that they saw Christianity, especially in religion, as a live option. But now apparently there's been a shift to people who, they haven't even rejected the sort of kind of weak late 20th century Christianity. They've just completely grown up without any sort of religious mooring, any sort of religious intuition. And so, all forms of religious belief are sort of equally foreign to them, which is, well, first of all, frankly, it's something I can't even imagine. It's like living life in black and white. But I don't
there
know.
was
I just thought
there
that was
was
a very interesting sociological observation. It's probably a first in all of human history because people fight over religion, against religion, they switch religion, but we've never had a sort of not just post-Christian society, but post-Christian generation. Is that so? I'm just very fascinated in that. How did you see that? Is it like reader mail?
well, I mean, just to take a small example, I'm apologize for forgetting who said this, but someone on Twitter X, whatever, just the other day said something like, they were setting up a reading group on, some famous essay, not a particularly religious essay. And they said they immediately ran into trouble because the essay takes as its central motif the story of Cain and Abel. And out of 12 people in the reading group, these are, late teenagers or something, 10 of the kids had never heard of Cain and Abel. Right.
Right.
So that's sort of a small but telling case study. But I think you can just see this. I think you see this in sort of personal experience, right? I'm not sort of deeply involved in the education of the young, but I live in New Haven. I do things at Yale. I have sort of exposure to university students in a way that I didn't 10 or 15 years ago, and that's sometimes helpful in sort of seeing how things are changing. I have exposure to peers and to peers' children. I had an interesting moment at eating lobster with some friends 5 years ago or something, and my mother, who is quite religious, was there, and somehow the conversation, she brought up angels because why not, and it became clear that the 9-year-old daughter of this person we were having dinner with didn't know what an angel was, had never heard of an angel, right? So you get sort of small examples like that, and then you can just see it in the data, right? So 15 years ago now, I wrote a book about American religion that was called Bad Religion. And that was all about what I called heresy, right? The argument that American religion sort of existed in this liminal
Also a
zone.
very good book, and
A
one which
brilliant,
was, another you you wrote not one but two books that were prophetic about Trump in ways that,
that was, yep, that
that
was
nobody
prophetic.
anticipated.
Right. And so Trump's support includes a number of the kind of sort of Christian adjacent, culturally Christian, prosperity gospel, these kind of things that I wrote about in the book. And all of that is still part of American culture. Don't get me wrong. There still is a lot of, sort of weakly Christian or attenuatedly Christian or heretically
Yeah,
Christian
yeah.
forms of faith. But I think the big change between when I wrote that book and this book is just that you have this cohort that is the new atheist onward cohorts, where you just have large numbers, as you say, of people raised who are a generation away from Christmas and Easter Christianity. Their parents were Christmas and Easter Christians and sort of stopped at some point in
Right.
their childhood, and that was it. They just didn't pick up. They didn't pick up
There's a
anything.
difference between a kind of secularism that defines itself against Christianity or
Right.
against religion, and one that just exists in a vacuum. I
I'm curious since you brought this point up, I'm curious about your sense of the French experience here, right? Because in certain ways, France seems, France secularized faster than the United States, had lower church mass attendance much sooner, right?
Yeah.
But do you have a sense that like your cohort had that experience, or is sort of the residual cultural Catholicism of France, the fact that you're, going into Notre Dame and Saint Denis and all these places, is that sufficient to sort of, is the French atheist of your cohort sort of
I mean,
still culturally Catholic?
my cohort, and who knows about Gen, Z, Y,
Yeah, who knows, right?
K, whatever they're called. My only experience to the youth is through my own kids who are in Catholic school, so it's definitely skewed. My sense is, so France has lower religious belief, but there's a stronger sense of present French culture being the last link in a long chain of culture that includes Christianity.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I would say that, my sort of French peer group compared to my sort of American peer group, my French peer group is definitely less religious in terms of belief and practice, but I never had the same kind of moment that well, not never, but much less, where I, they're much less ignorant about Christianity than the average educated French secular liberal is much less ignorant about Christianity as a kind of historical phenomenon than the average educated liberal in
liberal
America.
secular American. Yeah,
And
no,
so,
that seems plausible to me. Yeah,
eh,
it's interesting.
and so it's, I mean, from the perspective of, the soul and like winning souls, I'm not sure if it's a better thing, but it sort of makes it, less disorienting to live around, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, my own view, based on what I feel like I'm seeing in American culture now, is that there are actually benefits from a religious perspective to hitting a kind of bottom, right? That
Right.
sort of, and again, America's bottom is different from France's. We still have a stronger core of actual Christian practice, people
Right.
going to church and so on. But it does feel like, and I feel like COVID sort of finished this, that, like, we were going through a kind
Oh,
of
yes.
generational shift, and it might have continued until 2030 before bottoming out, but because of COVID, people stopped going to church, and it just sort of
Right,
accelerated some
right,
things,
right.
lets you hit bottom. And then once you hit a kind of bottom, you suddenly have a bunch of people who wouldn't have been interested in Christianity as it seemed to be, still
Yes.
influential but declining, but are suddenly willing to give it a new look.
Yes.
And that's sort of that's sort of the environment I'm trying to write into in this book.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, no, it's, I mean, we don't have any choice, but let's go, let's accelerate. So, another thing about the book, which I really liked, is that, you are an excellent prose writer. It's extremely frustrating. I found myself highlighting a bunch of passages. So I'm not going to quote everything. I'm just telling people it's a very pleasurable book to read if you enjoy high quality English prose. And so, for example, in the chapter on design, you write about, quote, the intuition that the world seems like a workshop and a cathedral and a theater and a machinist shop and more. And that was one of the best, ways I've seen of rendering what this intuition, which then leads to the argument of design, is. So that's very good. The first chapters, you know, you talk about the argument from design, you talk about these sort of classical arguments. It's fine. Uh, what I really liked was when you get to arguments for religious belief that people usually don't talk about because they're too polite to, which is religious experience and miracles. So, why is religious experience a sort of legitimate topic of inquiry for and a sort of legitimate
Yeah.
reason to believe, and one that sort of keeps reasserting itself, and one that should matter to, very reasonable and educated people?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of but you're right. I'm trying to sort of
I mean, we could
get
talk about the argument for design, but
no,
people have
I
had
think
that conversation a million times,
I
and we're
think
not the
those are
right people.
very,
Like,
I think those are, there are interesting things about those arguments that have sort of changed with advances in modern physics, but the fundamental
yes,
idea is very familiar from back and forths between atheists and non-believers. I think with religious experience, you're getting into terrain that's interesting on a few levels, right? The first is that it's just a primary reason that religion actually continues. And this is, I think, useful for, even the secular reader who sort of doesn't buy into my arguments, right? To sort of grasp this fact about the world, that, you
yes,
get these,
which
you
is,
get
which is also a fact about the world that I hadn't grasped.
right, that you hadn't grasped before
Well,
encountering my brilliant
all of
book,
the
or
people I
just
know who have had religious experience, or who I unless they haven't. All of the people I know who've had religious experience are Catholics. So
Oh, right. Yeah. So the scale, the
finding
scale and
out
scope.
that, people all over the world and throughout all time, and sometimes for no particular reason, sort of have these experiences. Although I'm going to let you describe it because you're going to do it much better than me. Yes, that was. I mean, I sort of knew it in theory, but what you explained really well is exactly this. It just sort of keeps happening and it keeps reasserting itself, even to people who are not seeking them, even to people who are sort of random. Anyway.
Yes, and that's I mean that's a big, you know, an important reality, because you'll get these sort of sometimes interesting, sometimes not, attempts to do sort of sociological and political explanations for, what is religion, where did it come from, why does it stick around, right? And it's like, okay, well, you have one conception of God in the tribal society, and then another conception that emerges for political reasons once you have monarchy, and so on and so forth, right? And and those, again, those arguments can be interesting, but it's really useful to understand that, why a big reason religion persists is that not only people who are out there trying to have a religious experience, but also people who are minding their own business, who don't believe in God at all, will have, experiences that a Christian would describe as an experience of the Holy Spirit or an encounter with the living God. There's also, the range of darker experiences, demonic and otherwise, that recur throughout human history and take different forms in different cultures, but you see a certain kind of commonality. And then there's the range of what you might call sort of the unclassifiable experiences that, a 17th century French peasant or Irish peasant more likely would have attributed to the fairies, and a 21st century person will say it was a UFO or it was aliens. But that too sort of persists and reinvents itself. And that reality just, it's important to say, if you're sort of assessing how seriously to take it, it's not something that our friends, the late 18th century rationalists necessarily expected would happen, right? If you go back and read David Hume, you just have this
Right.
real confidence that, look, the reason people believe in miracles is that there are a lot of legends from long ago. It's like Greek mythology. People like those stories. And then there's a church and it teaches them these things and they feel like they have to believe it. But, once you got rid of this cultural inheritance and the Inquisition and everything else, then you would expect, people would still be credulous in certain ways. You'd still have hucksters and so on, but you'd expect religious, sort of mystical stuff to fade dramatically. And nothing like that has happened, right? Which means that you can't just sort of explain these things as sort of features of a particular socio-political order, a particular education system, all these things. You need a different explanation. So at the very least, the religious believer can already sort of push the atheist backward a step on these questions from, this is just sort of created by, politics and reading assignments, to, okay, well, this is something cooked up in the mysteries of the human brain, right? Which is the current
Yeah.
atheist
So
materialist
okay, so
position.
I said, I was going to say it wouldn't make sense for me to play devil's advocate on the argument for design, because I agree with you completely, 100%. And so but I am going to play the devil's advocate here, literally. So Ross Douthat, I mean, people have been crazy forever. Like, people have, let's say, sometimes people have hallucinations. Sometimes people have sort of neurons that sort of randomly fire in the wrong way. Why should this particularly make me believe in God?
Right. So
Or in the
in the
numinous,
in the
or in the
numinous, right? I
existence
mean,
of a spiritual reality?
yeah, I think we should. I think belief in God makes. I mean, one of the points I try to make is you get to belief in God in part through convergence of different different lines of evidence, right? So the fact that you have supernatural experience and the fact that you have evidence for order and design and other pieces of evidence all, I think, converges on the likelihood of there being a God. Obviously, if you just have, an encounter with, well, let's say if you have one of the weirder spiritual encounters, it's not telling you anything necessarily about God. If you have the kind of experience that appears to be God himself, that's a different matter. But why should we take this seriously? Well, I think the first reason to take it seriously is there really just seems to be a significant distinction between some of the core forms of religious experience and what we understand of sort of hallucinations, insanity, and so on, right? And I'm not saying there can't sometimes be overlap. Obviously, there's a whole theory that epileptic experiences map onto certain kinds of spiritual experiences and so on. I'm based on my reading, I'm somewhat skeptical of that, but let's assume that there's some kind of overlap. Nonetheless, there's also just a very wide range of very significant and substantial spiritual experiences that just don't appear hallucinatory in the normal way we understand hallucinations. And just to take two examples, both of which exist around the frontier of death, which is sort of an interesting zone, right? In the late 19th century, there was sort of a high tide of interest in this stuff. This is when William James wrote Varieties of Religious Experience, and of course there was sort of the spiritualist craze, but there was a good collection effort done on how often people see people they know, like in a very palpable, perceptual, normal seeming way, immediately after the person has died. And often in cases where you have no way to know in advance that the person has died. It would be like if you died tomorrow and I didn't know it and I walked out my front door and I saw you standing by my minivan, right? And then you disappeared. These experiences,
and yes, this does happen, or people report
this happens a lot. And one thing to emphasize about this stuff too is a lot of people have these experiences or weird experiences of other kinds themselves and assume that it's some weird thing that just happened to them, because we're living in a culture that discourages talking too much about these things.
And so they don't talk about it because they don't want to seem weird.
Right. And so these kind of cases, one of the researchers studying them called them hallucinations of the sane, right? Because the people having them are not suffering from epilepsy. They're not taking a hallucinogenic drug. We could argue about that category in a different moment, but they're just sort of randomly in the middle of a normal existence having a completely lucid, realistic, impossible encounter that requires you to think not just that the brain does hallucinations or does dreams, but it has the capacity to generate very real seeming, sort of supernatural seeming manifestations. That's interesting. The same thing can be said in a stronger way of near-death experiences, which is a case where we just have, thanks to modern science and modern medicine, a lot more cases to work with, right? Like a lot more people are brought back from the brink of death than was ever true in the 1700s.
Interesting. Yeah.
And what you get from near-death experiences is a similar thing where the reports of them are not like the reports of dreams and hallucinations. They're not fragmentary. They're not self-contradictory. They don't have dream logic. They don't dissolve into randomness. They're generally described as more intense than ordinary life. More real than real is a phrase that gets used a lot. They have a lot of some differences, but a lot of consistency across cultures. They feature, again, the things that a religious person would expect them to feature: encounters with your departed relatives, encounters with divine seeming beings, encounters with something that appears to be like God, something heavenly. There are also some that seem more purgatorial and hellish. And I think, you can come up with materialist explanations for these things. It's hard to generate a Darwinian explanation because that's
a good point. Yeah.
Well, because most of them are presumably happening to people who just then go on to die, right? So if this is something that happens to you and then you expire, that it's like, the occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge or something, and it all happens in the instant before you die. what is this doing for you? And you have to come up with some story where, well, maybe it only happens to people who come back from death, like it's something the brain does as it's restarting to encourage people. But even then, it would happen so rarely in a pre-modern society that the idea that you would get selection for this in the brain is very strange. And again, is this like 100% proof of anything? No, but like if you had gone back 150 years or gone back to Hume and Voltaire and said to them, guess what? Over the next couple hundred years, we're going to bring a lot of people back from the dead, and some substantial number of them are, going to say they've seen heaven and angels and had a life review. Like a lot of people have this life review where they have experienced sort of a feeling of judgment as they look back over their life experience. And like, that seems like a point for religion, not the end of the argument, but it's a point. It's a point in its favor, and that I think is what. Again, there's a wider range of these experiences, but I think that both the particulars and the range give you more. They give you more reasons to think that the religious world picture has truth to it than you would have expected before we secularized. And also it's just like, you can just totally imagine a counterfactual world where people have near-death experiences that are just like hallucinations, or they are like dreams. You're like, I mean, The Sopranos did this a little bit. Tony had a near-death experience, but it had a lot of dream logic.
Of course, you had to bring up The Sopranos.
Well, right. Well, he does a good job, Chase, sort of playing around, David Chase, playing around with this stuff. But yeah, you could imagine a world where people have near-death experiences and they come back and they're like, yeah, I was in a car and there was a bird and someone had diarrhea in the back seat. And then we were like flying to the moon and then it all dissolved into chaos and so on, right? And there are things that happen like that. People do have hallucinations when they're in delirium and on the brink of death, but they're just clearly a completely different category from the classical
dreams
near-death
are not
experience.
the same things as visions, and people can tell the difference. By the way, another good thing about your book is it reminded me, I knew this already, but it reminded me just how much David Hume was the original Reddit atheist. It's just like everything he writes makes me want to reach out across time and space and slap him in the face, because it's literally like every sort of Reddit atheist idea comes from Hume. It's despairing.
Well, and Hume is, I mean, I think Hume raises what I actually think is a very potent idea that for atheists today, which is also part of why I wrote the book the way I did, right? Which is the idea that, if one religion is true, all the rest have to be completely fake, right? He says, look, there's no way, that the Chinese
we're going to talk about that.
Okay.
No, because, so religious experience, it's not in and of itself necessarily an argument, but it sort of is in the mix with the other arguments and point to it. And the fact that it's stubborn, the fact that it's sort of, it sort of imposes itself on the recipient in the sense that from the outside you can tell, it's a dream, but like if it happens to you, like the difference between a dream and a direct experience. It's not that. And so there's a power to religious experience, a power which is subjective. It's experienced only by the one who experiences it, but to that person who can be a perfectly sort of rational, intelligent, non-crazy person, they have this experience and they just know that it was not just electrons firing in their brain. I want to talk about the next chapter, which to me was perhaps the funnest chapter, where you go into the even more ridiculous argument for religious belief, which is one of my personal favorite arguments, which is the argument for miracles. Which is this was one of the things that frustrated me during the New Atheist stuff, which is particularly Christian and Catholics failed to point to miracles. and you reference a bunch of them. You reference the famous miracle of the sun, where in 1917, tens of thousands of people saw the sun dance in the sky in fulfillment of a prophecy. And you reference one of my favorite books, which is the book They Flew, which is absolutely wild. Can you well, first of all, talk about miracles in general and why they're important, and then I'm going to have some fun. We're going to discuss our favorite miracles.
Yeah, right. I mean, miracles are obviously important to Christianity because they're a big part of what happens in the New Testament, even before we get
Yes,
around to
but
the resurrection, right? It's
Christian and
clear,
Catholic
right?
apologists will rarely
Well,
discuss
even
miracles.
I think this is maybe a Catholic Protestant distinction, actually. I mean, where sort of if you're in evangelical worlds, evangelical Christian worlds, you hear, which I was for a while growing up, you hear a lot more about miracles, and if you're in sort of obviously if you're steeped in Catholic piety, you hear a lot about miracles. They're
Yes,
a big part of
growing up, but
canonization and beatification. But yeah, it's not. I think there is an embarrassment about citing them too much if you're writing a column for the New York Times, for hypothetically, right? But the New Testament strongly suggests that you should treat miracles as God's evidences and signs and indicators, right? That they're important to God's action in the world. They're not moral rewards; they're sort of signposts and signifiers. More than that, and you have an awful lot of them. And again, you have a lot of them, and by a lot of them, I just obviously mean a lot of claimed miracles, because it's hard to establish with 1,000% accuracy when a miracle has definitively occurred. But the Catholic Church tries very, very hard to sort of generate serious medical testimony and medical analysis of every miraculous healing that is imputed to a potential saint. And the Catholic Church has had no difficulty over the last 200 years continuing to make saints, canonize saints, find cases where people prayed for intervention and something very strange and rapid and sudden and medically inexplicable seemed to happen to them. And so, as with near death experiences and other forms of mysticism, you have a kind of atheist expectation that these things should fade under modern conditions, under the light of science, and they really don't fade at all. And again,
yes.
if you get beyond the world where the Catholic Church is trying to get, five medical experts to ratify something in particular, and just move into the larger circle of people who haven't tried to, hire six doctors to certify something, but have just had a pretty crazy experience. There are a lot of good books, again, including by evangelicals, sort of that try and enumerate, what share of the Christian population around the world claims to have had some kind of miraculous experience.
Oh, wow.
It's quite high. I think I
That's an
referenced
interesting question. Yeah.
one of them in the book, but it's a quite substantial share, and you can find I don't know what an example that is sort of, I didn't cite in the book. I may have encountered it after the reading of it, but if you Google like pastor recovers voice miraculously, you'll find this is just tremendously moving. It's a evangelical pastor who'd had a disease of the throat that basically rendered his voice, somewhat inoperable. He could still speak, but it was incredibly painful and strained. And he just sort of went on with his life. And one day he was giving a sermon about, sort of miracles and how when God acts, and they have the audio of the sermon, you can hear
Oh,
on the
wow.
sermon when his voice comes back, and it's quite remarkable. Now, is it remarkable in a way that definitively establishes that a miracle happens? No. And but it leaves the non-believer in a position where you really have to impute this kind of extraordinary power to the human mind. In a lot of these cases, you have to say, well, it wasn't a miracle because the person expected a miracle, and so their mind, through some mysterious pattern we don't understand, contrived to, increase antibody flow or blood flow or something and
Right.
cause this miracle, right? And that is it's a difficulty because the materialist is also, while they're doing that, they're also trying to prove that consciousness doesn't really exist, right? So this is sort of the two. They're running. Well, you see this a lot. Like each discrete thing that the materialist is trying to explain away, they may have some
I'm trying to
success.
come up with this because the atheist line is the god of the gaps, and it's really like the void of the gaps. It's like
Right, the atheist is running
when
around trying to
somebody's
reduce
miraculously
here.
healed from a terminal disease, and it's like,
That was their amazing consciousness, and then you're like, oh, consciousness is indeed amazing, and they're like, no, it's an illusion. You're like, okay, you have to pick one, right? But you mentioned Carlos Ayres They Flew. I think, the Tyler.
I mean, it's the what I really recommend it after you've bought Ross's book. It's one of the wildest books I've ever read. And another benefit of your book is that there's tons of references or recommendations to other books on all sorts of fascinating topics, such as, scientific studies into religious experience, miracles, social history of religion, which I want to get to. It is an amazing book that describes the very real historical testimony. Like the testimonies are real historical facts, like that people testified to these things, which is that for a period of about 150 years, mostly in Spain, but not only, a lot of Christian mystics flew and levitated, and many times they did it in front of hundreds or thousands of people. Many
Right.
times they did it on demand. They did it, in front of people who traveled from across Europe to see it and didn't believe it. One Protestant queen sort of converted to Catholicism after she traveled all the way to Europe to see a man fly. And this is not even the wildest part of the book, because it also discusses bilocation.
Yep. Yes, it does.
Including the case of a nun who was cloistered her entire life in a Spanish village
Yep.
and simultaneously spent 4 years in the Americas evangelizing Indian tribes.
Yes.
It is by a professor at a very reputable university who writes this in a totally straight way with his tongue magnificently planted in his cheek. It is just an amazing book. Anyway.
Yes, and it's a great reading experience, as you say, because the author Carlos Ayres writes it as in a very normal academic style, right? And you, as the unsuspecting reader, you have to get a certain distance in before you realize, oh, the author does in fact think these things happened, doesn't he? But it also gets at what is the prime objection to claims about miracles, right? Which is, I did a conversation with, Tyler Cowen, the economist, who we both, know his work well. And this is sort of where he sort of got stuck on, right? He was like, look, Ross, fine, healing miracles, all these things are fine. But where is the video, the compelling video of, of the impossible, right? Like we don't know what's happening at the molecular level when someone suddenly recovers from cancer. There's endless debate with endless competing academic papers trying to prove or disprove the existence of things like precognition and psychic powers. I know
Yes,
some
I
people.
discovered that thanks to you, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, I know some people, smart people, who think that basically we have good evidence for this and that it's just sort of ruled out by materialist premises. But I also know smart people who think
don't tell the CIA.
Well, right. Well, there's replication crisis issues in this, right? Where you get you get a bunch of papers and you're like, well, but we have a bunch of papers proving a lot of things, and how can you replicate it? There's also phenomena where You can get replication from, the author who believes in the supernatural does a paper, and the author who doesn't believe in it does a paper, and they try and use exactly the same experimental controls, and the one who believes gets favorable results and the one who doesn't, right? So, there's a lot going on there, but I think it is fair for the materialist to say, look, in the past it seems like we had claims of levitating saints, and if we had a levitating saint right now, that would be a big deal. I think to read the Air book is to realize that the levitations of the 17th century really do pass every historical test, except
Right.
we have them on videotape, right? So then the question is, why don't we have them right now? And I would not be personally surprised if, at some point in the next 100 years. I mean, there are a few claims of Buddhist levitations, but
I love our friend Tyler, but like this is obviously not true. Like if you showed Tyler a picture of a monk in Spain taking off into the air, he would say, "Well, that's probably AI. That's probably special effects. That's probably like it wouldn't change his religious beliefs at all." And in a sense, to his credit, like if you completely change your worldview based on a single video, that there's probably something wrong. I mean, I was having this thought experiment. Like, imagine Richard Dawkins is at a debate with some Christian apologist, and all of a sudden, with hundreds of people in attendance, and all of a sudden, a light appears in the ceiling, and a loud booming voice shouts, "I exist." Would Richard Dawkins suddenly, I exist, and by the way, the Roman Catholic Church is the true church, and all its dogmas are correct? Like, would Dawkins suddenly convert to Catholicism? No, of course not.
I don't think he would. I do think, though, that you can imagine a world where, let's say the argument that Ayer makes in the book that I actually think is quite convincing, right, is that you don't get levitation today because we just aren't a culture that has lots of people practicing crazy Catholic asceticism anymore, right? So it's like anything. If you have thousands and thousands of people being crazy Catholic ascetics, right? I was, talking to someone the other day who was like, studies Vincent de Paul. It's like, how many hours a day did Vincent de Paul pray? It's like, well, 7-10 hours a day, right? Like constant, sort of constant prayer that there are monastic communities that do it, but it's certainly less common.
Yes.
So it might be that you need that intensity to get some of these crazier things. But I do think that there are certain things that could happen that wouldn't convince everyone, but would sort of cause something of a paradigm shift gradually back towards a more, supernaturalist view of the world. Again, without per se convincing one individual person, right? So like there's this podcast series called the Telepathy Tapes right now that claims that
is there
a set of autistic kids manifest telepathic powers, and that this is like actually quite obvious and easy to establish if you watch these videos and do these things and so on. I am quite skeptical of this series, in part because it seems to me to claim too much. Like they're like, oh yeah, they're seeing things with like 90% accuracy and so on, right? And
like
my impression,
mentalism is sort of well established as a kind of category of
right?
trickery.
I think the argument here is that it's not trickery; it's that the parents are sort of, without even being conscious of it, are sort of guiding the kids in these certain ways. Anyway,
I have horse that could do math.
I have not dug. I have not developed a complete opinion on this. I have a certain skepticism, but I do think that, like, if it were the case that you could run a bunch of papers establishing this, it would in fact change some people's minds. And in that sense, it is at least somewhat reasonable for the non-believer to say, bring out the levitating saints, right? I just think Tyler should be careful because we might bring them out at some point.
Yes. Well, I mean, I'm for it. I just don't think most people make up their mind based on evidence. I mean, there's a lot of stuff I want to talk about. You see, and we're almost 1 hour in. I guess, you know,
Well, I can come back yet again,
I
Pascal,
mean,
in a few when you need
well,
a
we
fill-in
could do
guest.
3 hours. I guess I do have to sort of poke you a little. As I read the book, I already questioned you about this previously, and as I read the book, I sort of accepted it more. But there's a kind of, indifferentist vibe to your book, and even though it ends with a sort of thinly disguised appeal for Christianity, let's put it that way, because it's an appeal to Christianity, but you put it in, here's why it makes sense to me. So and I scribbled in the margin in my notes when I was reading it. There's a vibe of, you may want to explore this tradition or that tradition, if polytheism makes more sense to you. And I sort of wrote this in my notes. I wrote, are we going to get jihadists for Douthat? It's like, oh, I read Ross Douthat's Believe,
And
and I followed his advice. And I realized
I
that,
mean, it's
Wahhabi
yep.
Islam is,
That
it's what worked for
that
me.
that is
And so,
when that happens.
that's
When that happens,
that's
I
that's
will.
when that's why I shut up the shopping mall. um
Yeah,
I
no, I
mean,
think that's a.
joking aside, I guess a way of framing this in a way that's just not just saying that it's bad or it's good. um one way of contrasting this is with the approach of somebody like Bishop Barron, who I think starts from the same premise as you, which is that society is completely secularized. And his thing that he's quite open about is, therefore, we should sort of lean into the weirdness of Catholicism. We shouldn't be like, oh, almost every great religion has elements of truth in it. Let's sort of ease you into the idea of belief. No, let's lean into the weird. Let's lean into like the a Catholicism that's sort of like extremely Catholic, because it's unsettling, because it's sort of differentiating. Um, and of course, one answer is to say both approaches are fine. We need both. But I guess, if I'm going to phrase it
Well,
as a question,
no,
what
I
made you
think.
choose that approach, I
Well,
guess?
I think, and this may be a tension, that on which my project founders a little bit, but I think that the representatives of the institutional Catholic Church should do exactly what Bishop Barron says they should do, right? And
Right.
I've been tweaked a little for the book. Like folks like Andrew Sullivan have said, "Oh, Ross, you sound like Pope Francis." And of course, I've been, critical of the Holy Father in the past, right? But I guess my view is that the position of the lay professional arguer speaking to, a very mixed audience is somewhat different from the position of the Pope. And I want the Pope, and the bishops to be weird and to assert that, Catholicism is the true faith and everyone should be converted to it. That is their job. Um, but I think it's okay for that to be their job, and for me to say to people
Right.
that, that clearly God works through a lot of different avenues and agencies and institutional forms, right? And striking that balance is really hard, because once you say that, it becomes really easy to say, and therefore all religions are equal. And
Right.
honestly, I think the Pope himself falls prey. I see. I can't resist criticizing the Pope, but I think the Pope, in some of his comments, doesn't seem to get this balance quite right. You want the Pope to say, yes, many religions contain elements of divinity, and
Right.
there are virtuous people in all the major faiths, and God is present in different ways, but Catholicism is the fullness of truth and you should convert to it. And the Pope is hesitant about that. So I'll be straightforward. I think Catholicism is the fullness of truth and everyone should convert to it. But there are lots of people
Right.
who sincerely have a set of experiences or have a set of intellectual reactions to things that do not immediately lead them to be Catholic. And what should those people do? And one answer is they're fucked, right? And sorry. And my view from knowing and observing the world, right, is that there are people who, are just not like, there are people who are raised as cradle Catholics who have a totally dead, sterile experience of the faith. And some of those people, you're not going to get them immediately by like God. I'm not going to say God is not going to get them immediately by just pulling them
Right.
into Latin Mass Catholicism. He's he's going to walk with them through some other things that let them come back to hopefully the truth at the end. Or even if they don't get back to the truth all the way, and this is where I am a little bit of a lib, right? I think that the sincere person who goes in search of God and finds God in some form outside the Catholic faith and tries to live their life in a proper relationship to God, that as long as that person is not aware that Catholicism is true and rejecting it, that person is, I I don't think that person is doomed to perdition. I do think hell is real. I'm not a universalist in that sense, but I am a lib of some sort in my view of how and who gets to heaven.
That's fine, and your liberalism, quote unquote, happens to be perfectly orthodox in this specific case. No, I just think
Reasonably.
it's an interesting, um, you know, the sort of the heart of the book and the most, the trade-off implicit in your approach, and that's the approach you went with, and I agree with you. I think it's needed in the discourse. It's not the way every public Christian should speak, but it's a very good way to sort of get people to it. But you get to this issue of, you say, oh, there are all these ways that point to religious belief, like the appearance of design, like religious experience, like the mystery of consciousness, and so on and so forth. And there's all of these great religious traditions have some wisdom, some purchase on the truth, et cetera, et cetera. And then you sort of talk yourself into saying, well, doesn't that mean that you should just be like an agnostic and a seeker? And then you're like, no, actually, that means you should commit to something. You should commit to a religious tradition. Um, I That's the hardest thing for a sort of modern person to do, to commit to anything, to commit to a marriage, to commit to military service, or any sort of form of vocation that's seen as like onerous
Yep.
and demanding service. Um, and so the issue of commitment, that you sort of work through and struggle through, is, I think, in many ways the key to the book. So I guess, you know, I want to ask to just talk about that, or explain, what your argument. Yeah, just talk.
Yeah.
What is your argument for commitment? Why should somebody who sort of has a sense that there is a spiritual layer to reality, there is a out there, but they shouldn't just be an agnostic seeker, they should commit to a faith tradition?
I mean, I think it's okay to be an agnostic seeker for a bit, right? Like
Right.
you read some scriptures, you say some
It,
prayers,
it
you
was a
conduct some
phase in
experiments,
college.
right? I mean, yeah, like that. But at a certain point, you have to assume that religious practice is like any other form of human endeavor.
Right.
It's really hard to get that far on your own. And it's hard because it's hard for intellectual reasons, because, we all know autodidacts who, sometimes come up with great insights and have interesting things to say. But generally, the autodidact at some point has to benefit from entering more fully into the conversation of the educated world. That the same has to be true in religion. That you have to enter into some shared conversation that has some shared premises to make any kind of intellectual progress. The same is true sort of practically, right? To the extent that religion is a discipline, you're trying to pray and do good works and all of these things. It would be very weird to say, I'm going to take up soccer or football, as you Francais call it, right? And just kick the football in the backyard, and become really good at kicking the football in the backyard and never join a team, right? Like you would be missing something clearly. And more than that, you probably wouldn't actually pull it off, right? Like this is the reality. You may say every day, all by myself, I'm going to, read the Bhagavad Gita and say these 16 prayers and then go give alms, right? And it'll just be my religion. Okay. Are you really going to do that unless you have some form of of community and some kind of, sort of social pressure? Would I go to a random church every weekend if I didn't belong to a church that tells me I have to get my kids to mass every week? I think I know what the answer is. I would not, right? So they're all, I mean, and this is a utilitarian argument, right? In a sense, there are sort of benefits from tradition and community and all of these things that are really hard to recreate in the individual. But then also the sort of the final point, and I guess, I said this close to the start, right? But it's the demons, right, that are also an issue here, which is
that was my next and final. Well,
this is where we can end. We can end here, because I have to go back and take care of some of those children. But if you assume that spiritual realities exist and that supernatural realities exist, there's really no reason to assume that they're perfectly safe. Like if the natural world is not perfectly safe, why would the supernatural world be perfectly safe?
Tell us everything you think about demons, Ross Douthat.
Well, I have very conventional opinions about demons, which is that there are supernatural entities out there that are not in a positive relationship with the higher order of the universe and are not in a positive relationship with us and want bad things to happen to us. And if you go around sort of declaring yourself spiritually open in some way without having any sense of like what you want to enter into you, these forms and these beings might very well prey upon you, right? And you can do a version of this argument where you don't have to assume the demons are real. You can just assume that like there are bad experiences out there, and like if you take ayahuasca, maybe the demons you encounter aren't real, but it still messes you up. I mean, that's fine.
You still get one-shotted by the
Mesoamerican, right?
Yeah, Mesoamerican demon.
But I think from the case for religion that I find persuasive encompasses the reality of demonic experiences. And you see these people now, right? I mean, you'll see people who take psychedelics who will say, what do you do when you encounter a negative entity? And there's all this debate about it on the online forum. It's like, well, maybe it's a part of yourself and it's like your Jungian shadow and you need to integrate it. And I'm like, maybe, but probably not, right?
Right.
Or you have, our mutual friend Rod Dreher, right? He's posting a lot about UFOs these days. And he posted. Is he? Yeah, you've noticed, right? But he posted something, there's these people who think you're supposed to get in touch with UFOs psychically, right? And the way you do it,
of course there is
by standing there and saying, I'm here, whatever's out there, please come on in. And I don't think
that's definitely not a good idea.
Whatever's out there, come on in is a good idea, right? And one of the uses of the technology of a traditional religion is that, and this includes the Eastern religions, right? They also have conceptions of demons and the demonic, is that, you were saying, okay, here's how you try and do mystical experience. Here's how you protect yourself and your soul while doing it. Here are some guidelines for the kind of experiences you're looking for and the kind you aren't. And that's just, I think for people, again, like the people we've been talking about, sort of who have no grounding in religion, who are sort of setting off on a spiritual journey, that those kind of defenses and guardrails are just tremendously potentially valuable, and there's a lot at stake, right? Like once you
Yes.
stipulate a soul, there are real
Right.
stakes to spiritual exploration.
I mean that's the sort of smackdown logic, which is once you accept the existence of souls and the existence of a kind of spiritual realm, why wouldn't you also accept the existence of demons? That it seems totally arbitrary to accept the first two and not the third. And if you accept the existence of demons, then you need to take precautions, and the best or the most commonsensical precautions come from sophisticated, longstanding faith traditions. So that is the argument for religion from the demonic by
The argument from demons.
the
Yep.
argument from demons, which is a very good argument. I mean, I it's one of my regular tweets, but it's absolutely true. Which is, I understand why some people don't believe in God. I don't understand people who don't believe in Satan, because like if you look at the world for 5 minutes, like the case for the existence of Satan seems very very straightforward in a way that yeah, I don't know. I you and I like to joke about the demonic and such, but on the merits I absolutely agree with you. um
Yeah, I mean, you want to be
there are
careful, right?
negative
Like I think
spiritual
your point.
forces out
I
there.
once knew. I've known like Catholic exorcists who say, that they'll have people who will write to them who are clearly looking to have faith, who will be like, "Well, show me some evidence of the demonic because it will help me
Show me a
become
demon.
religious." And you want to be careful with that too. I didn't write a lot about the demonic in this book, in part because I think it is a
Yes, don't
strong
seek
case for
out
religion,
demons,
but it's a
kids.
bad idea to even think about it too much. So
That's true. That's also true. Which is why I kept it
for the end,
for
that's
the end
right.
of the podcast.
See people off.
All right.
Pascal, I can't thank you enough. This was wonderful, and I am delighted to come back, and be your first three-peat guest at some point in the future.
Yes. Thank you very no, the pleasure was all mine. It's a great book. People should definitely buy it, hopefully read it, and give it to their friends and so on and so forth. All right. Goodbye.